Hey everybody, and welcome back. In the previous video, we set the lighting, and today we're gonna take care of some basic compositing. First, let's switch our 3D viewport into the compositor and make sure we enable nodes. Now, there are a few options that you can go for, either render your image and then do the compositing, or you can do live compositing, which basically is enabling the changes that you do in the compositor to be visible in the viewport, and I'm going to do that. To do it, from the top right corner in your viewport shading settings, just make sure that compositor is switched from disabled to always. Now everything that we place here, for example, let's add a curves adjustment. Once we tweak it, we will be able to see the result here in the viewport. Of course, keep in mind that not everything is supported, so there will be some settings that we can do here that will take effect in the viewport, and there will be some that we won't be able to observe. For example, like cryptomat. And we're gonna have to render our image to continue working with those. But for the basic compositing, I like to do it, I like doing it live, so let's get to it. There are a few nodes that I regularly use. First one is the color balance. This is my general node for introducing contrast or just adjusting the brightness and the contrast. Let's just switch from lift and gamma gain to offset power slope. And the first one, the offset, basically brings all of the colors up or down. The next one will control the contrast, so it's shifting the mid values. And the last one is bringing the highlights up. If you want to create a better contrast, we can just bring the two sliders up. There's something really cool here that you can do, is you can actually introduce some color either into your darker values or into your brighter values, and it really depends on your taste. You can create some really interesting effects, like make your shadows darker, for example. But for this case, I'm really going to skip this part and just bring the contrast up a little bit. Now, there's one thing that I want to mention, is that in the render settings, when we go into color management, for this project I'm using the filmic tone map, and my look is set to none, as I'd like to control it from the compositor rather than relying on the presets that are here. Of course, if you like them, you can stick with them, maybe they will be enough for your project and your needs, but in this case I'll just, like I said, I'll stick to none and create the adjustments here. Also, if you don't have a filmic tone map, so if you're using an older version of Blender and you only have standard, it's very simple to recreate it. Just create a curves adjustment, so an RGB curves, and it's fairly simple. Basically, you want to really squish the highlights and bring down the darks, just slightly. Of course, this is a bit too exaggerated. And there, we almost have the same result. Of course, you might need to play with the curves a little bit until you get something that you like, but the general idea is that filmic tone map really squishes down the highlights. Cool, let's get rid of that and go back to using filmic. So, like I said, we can use the color balance for introducing general contrast, and one node that I use for controlling the colors is the hue correct. Now, this is a very powerful node for the simple reason that we can pick a color and adjust its hue, saturation and value directly, so we can make very fine adjustments. For example, here we have the roses in red, and if we take the slider, if we take the curve at the red point, once we bring it up, we will increase the saturation. If we bring it down, If we bring it down, we will lower the saturation. And keep in mind, now it's in the saturation mode. Okay, for this case, I want to slightly desaturate the whiskey. So let's go here in the yellow zone and bring it down just a little bit. Great. And if we go into value, we can also darken it slightly, or actually brighten it. Let's see which looks better. The thing with compositing and color grading is that there's a lot of experimenting. Unless you have a very clear vision, you will go through a lot of different variations. You should test things out, try them. Sometimes I would create one node, duplicate it, and just put in different settings and quickly switch between the two. So whether it's this or this. Okay, let's go with that. Now, the next thing that I want to do is to add some lens distortion. Now, the thing with CG is that when you render with a camera in your computer, pretty much you can get perfect perspective. So there's no lens distortion. All of the horizontal lines are perfectly horizontal. All of the vertical lines can be perfectly vertical. That really doesn't exist in real life for the simple reason that the camera lens is curved, and that gives a slight curve to the whole image. So let's create a lens distortion node, and I'll set it to fit. The reason is that once we render it, we want our image to be fit in the aspect ratio rather than to be distorted in it. And there are two options that we can play with. One is distortion, and like I said, this will generally apply the curvature to the image, and I usually stick with very low values. And the other one is dispersion. Now, dispersion simulates chromatic aberration. What chromatic aberration is the mismatch of the RGB channels in your image because of imperfections in your lens, at least in the case of photography. To make it clear, let's just crank up the setting, and as you can see, on the fringe of the render, so on the near the border, we get the distortion, and this is a more or less realistic effect, even though it's very exaggerated at the moment. Pretty much every photo will have it, even in the slightest, and this is because of imperfections in the glass. Of course, for product shots like this, it's best if we don't have it. Examples where you will have dispersion, and it's most surely that you will have, it's in very high contrast images. So for example, in exterior shots where there is intensive sunlight, adding just a little bit of dispersion really brings things, really makes them a little bit more realistic. So in this case, I will add a very slight value. As you can see, it is almost unnoticeable, but it's there. Great. Now, there are a few other things that I want to do, and for that case, I really would need to render the image. To make it more clear, I actually want to add some bloom and glare. So to do that, we need a glare node. And again, this is one of the effects that you get because of slight imperfections in your camera lens, and there's always some kind of highlight. Now at the moment this is extremely exaggerated, and the star shape isn't really that good. To be honest, the glare node in Blender is really bad in my opinion. It's just the results that it does are very far from realistic, and at the moment the best lens effects, the best glare that you can get, I think comes in V-Ray. But we're working with Blender now, so let's see what we can do with glare. Now the thing is, I don't want streaks. What I want is fog glow, but like I said, this for some reason isn't supported in the real-time compositor. so it doesn't really work whether I mute it or not. So for this case, we're gonna need to render the image and composite it offline. So let's see what we can do with the render settings. We have already set up the dicing scale for the viewport and for the renders. The next thing that we want is in sampling. So to figure out what kind of samples you need, I would usually just take a look at my render and I will make sure that I'm seeing the statistics. So you can see how many samples you have and how your image looks at those samples. So for this example, 512 samples seem to be plenty. So let's just go here in max samples and do that. And for the noise threshold, I usually put something really low. Most render engines will aim for a noise threshold of 0.01. This is starting to look like a clear image. If you want a perfectly clear image, you can go for 0.03, for example, or 5. Usually stick it with 0.03. And in order to get that render quality, you need to crank up the samples as much as you can. Basically, the logic is whichever setting is reached first. So if a pixel reaches that level of noise, cycles will stop sampling, and if cycles reaches the sample limit first, it will stop trying to reach the noise level. Okay, in this case we're also using denoising, so let's just enable that, so we don't really need to care about the noise threshold that much. And whether you use the open image denoiser, or the optics denoiser, really depends on your taste. The results will be mostly the same. There are a few differences that I've noticed. So the open image denoiser is a little bit slower because it runs on Intel, on your CPU rather than your GPU. And the optics denoiser runs on your GPU, so it's a little bit faster. And I've noticed that it works a little bit better on animations. So this is a final render, so I'm going to use the Intel denoising. One thing that you can do with cycles is, even though you have lower samples, because you're using denoiser, you can apply a little trick, and that's to just render a much higher resolution. That way you'll get a very sharp and clear render. Okay, let's stop that and hit F12 so that we can get a render. Of course, we need to do some waiting, and I'm going to fast forward this part, so see you in a bit. Okay, here's one more thing that I missed, so let's get back, and in the render settings we can go into layers, and I just wanted to mention that I've rendered everything with CryptoMatte set to object. My advice is that once you open a Blender, just make sure you have CryptoMatte enabled and save this in your startup file so that you always render with CryptoMatte. It's a lifesaver whenever you want to do some color corrections by object. Depending on the project, I might enable things like Z or mist pass, sometimes normals, and most of the time I would make use of the light render layers, for the simple reason that you can use them to change the color of an object, completely switch the material, etc. But in this case we have a very simple render, so I'm going to skip on that. Now, to continue compositing, I'll just maximize this viewport, and one thing that I'm going to do is enable the backdrop. Now, we don't really have a backdrop, but in order to see it, we need to add a viewer node and connect our last node into the viewer. Great. Now this looks a little bit big, but we can reshape that. Just select the viewer node and you will get controls for the size. And the way I'm moving the image instead of the composition is by holding Alt and dragging with the middle key, with the middle mouse button. So let's make this even smaller so that we can fit it in our viewport. And great. Now I can adjust the fog glow. Now the first setting, medium, high, low, basically tells what kind of version of your render will be used for the glare. And using medium or low means that it will use a lower resolution of your image to calculate the glow. I usually always switch to high and then play with the mix, threshold and size. I want the effect to be very subtle, so let's just bring the size a little bit. And the next thing we need to figure out is the threshold. Basically, the threshold determines which pixels will get a highlight effect. So as you know, brighter pixels hold a brighter value compared to darker ones, and the threshold means pixels with a value higher than 1 in this case will have a glow effect, and if we change that, it will limit the glow effect, and if we lower it, it will make it cover more and more of the image. Let's give it a second to calculate and we'll be able to see. Great, now pretty much everything has a glow effect. Usually applying it so liberally might work well for exterior shots where you have a lot of sky and a lot of contrast. Usually the sky gets a lot of glow in pretty much every camera shot, but in this case we don't really need it. I want it just focused on a few pieces. So let's bring up the threshold. What the mix will do is actually mix between your original image and just the glow layer. So here we can see only the glow effect separated on another layer, and if we go into value of -1, we will see only the original layer. So let's mix in the glow just a little bit more. Okay, one last thing that I want to show you is how to use CryptoMatte. So to do that, you need to add a CryptoMatte node. We need to feed it an image. Great. And we need to select an ID. So for example, let's select the bottle. Now what we can do is add any kind of color corrections. So let's just get a hue saturation value, plug our image, and if I connect this to the viewer, you will see that we have only the bottle selected. Now any kind of adjustments that we make will affect just the bottle. That's why the CryptoMatte render layer is just so powerful. It's just very useful in any situation. Anytime you need to make some specific adjustments on an object, you can just do it here. And in this case, I will add a curves adjustments, but not time curve, RGB curves, and I will slightly add contrast to the bottle. So just a slight S curve. Come on. Maybe a little bit stronger. Okay, that looks good. Let's arrange things and mix it back into the original render. To do that, we need a mix node, so let's take that, plug it here, and just mix the two images. We can back to viewing the glare node directly so we can see the whole image, and that's fun. Let's take the matte and plug it into the factorial of the mix node. Great, now we're getting a mix between the two, the color corrected version of our bottle and the rest of the image. This comes in handy in situations where, for example, you have other objects in your scene that are blocking the highlights. And what you will do is simply render an image like that, then render another one with the other props, and mix the two so that you get a nice highlight across the whole image, across the whole bottle. One last thing that I want to mention is, in case you're rendering an animation, don't forget to add an output node, but not this one, a file output. And here set where you want to save your frames after each render. Great. Now that we're almost done, all we need to do is save our image. So let's go into our image editor so we can get out of here, open up our rendered view, or another thing that you can do is just switch from your 3D viewport to your image editor and select the render result. And from here, just select image, save as, let's just name it .png, and I usually save it as PNG and just remove all of the compression. And there you have it, we have a complete render. Of course, like I said, this is the last part of our tutorial, and if you have any ideas for other topics, I'd love to cover them. And once again, subscribe for more videos, and thanks for watching. Oh, one more thing, you can find the scene in the video description. Bye!